Pro-abortion rights protesters reached Justice Alito's home in Fairfax County yesterday. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin said they were coordinating with authorities to monitor the situation. Some users pointed out that Virginia law makes picketing outside of homes illegal, so Youngkin allegedly could have dispersed the crowd but chose not to.
Yesterday, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell condemned the protest that took place outside of Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Roberts' Maryland homes. Let's watch.
We've seen angry crowds assemble at judges' private family homes. Activists published a map of their addresses. Law enforcement has had to install a security fence around the Supreme Court itself. Trying to scare federal judges into ruling a certain way is far outside the bounds of First Amendment speech or protest. It is an attempt to replace the rule of law with the rule of mobs. It appears this may possibly be flat out illegal.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki commented on the matter, saying, quote, "We have not seen violence or vandalism against Supreme Court justices. We have seen it at Catholic churches. That's unacceptable," adding that the president does not support that. And while we understand the passion, the president's position is to keep the protests peaceful. Psaki also discussed McConnell saying a national abortion ban was possible if Roe v. Wade is overturned. She told reporters, quote, "I think we are at serious risk when asked about the possibility of this coming to fruition." All right, I mean, this is something that's been hotly debated. Some people who otherwise are very pro-free speech absolutist even, are saying that protests, which to date have been peaceful outside of the homes of these Supreme Court justices, is something other than the very protest rights that the First Amendment seems to protect. Where are you on this, Robby?
Nope. You're right, and I call out the left a lot on free speech-related hypocrisy, but it's absolutely true that there's free speech-related hypocrisy on the other side as well, all the time. It is important to note, and I noted this yesterday when Kim and I talked about it, but protest, I don't know what the Virginia statute about picketing is, and who knows if that statute is even constitutional. The First Amendment is very clear. You can protest in the street and on the sidewalk, not on people's lawns. Maybe you can't, maybe there's a noise violation issue past a certain time. And I think it's fine to ask or wonder whether this is a good and effective tactic, but it looks to me so far like it's very clearly protected speech. So let's not be involving the police or talking about those kinds of things. As for the Supreme Court itself, having to put up a fence around it is regrettable. I don't know what leg Republicans have to stand on around that. They put up fences around the Capitol at a great distance after what Trump's people did. So that's definitely a both sides thing.
So some people have raised this hypothetical. They've asked if liberals, progressives, leftists, the broad left would feel uncomfortable if, let's say, there were some ruling that limited the Second Amendment rights and a bunch of Second Amendment protesters were outside of, let's say, Sotomayor's home. And I do think it is perhaps unprincipled to object to that as long as, again, the protests remain peaceful. Now, the specter of the Second Amendment and what it means does probably cause people's heckles in the back of their neck to raise a little bit in a way that they might not feel about this case. But I think on a pure one-for-one comparison, you have to be open to this in all kinds of contexts. These are public figures who, as many people have pointed out, have come down with a ruling, a draft opinion. We'll see what ultimately comes out. But a draft opinion which seems to indicate that women, are going to be threatened with much more significant bodily harm, real bodily harm, than simply standing outside of one's home in protest. And people have also, taken this moment to point out all of the, about 11, I think, abortion providers and people affiliated have been killed over the last 20 years or so, the kind of violent vitriol that happens outside of abortion clinics and women's health clinics, people who have served as escorts to women, which is a thing that has to exist because of how much violence is outside of these clinics. People who serve as escorts say that they've taken the bus to perform that role because otherwise their license plates will be tracked and people will follow them to their home with these kind of anti-choice messaging. So it does seem a little rich for folks who were never concerned about any of that behavior to now be concerned about the protesting of federal judges who have so much power and who immediately were backed up by Congress, who can't pass anything, but they could pass additional security measures overnight for the Supreme Court justices.
And I would have no trouble if Sotomayor had an unfavorable ruling on gun rights or any other thing that I disagreed with, and people were protesting outside of her home. I would say, well, they have the right to do that. It's probably not a great idea. I tend to think this is probably not a great idea. Honestly, my view to protesters in general is probably something along the lines of cool it, because I think not for they absolutely have the right to do it. I will defend their right. I am probably not all that persuaded that protesting in general is a very effective use of one's time, even for political change. I think maybe that was not true in the past. Protesting has obviously been effective at points in our history. It doesn't seem it seems very performative today, and that there is and then the actual violence and destruction that occurs is terrible and is not something that communities want, even communities who care about those issues. That's not like a really hard opinion that I have.
I think there's something to that.
You know, what is the upside of these things? What are the really, where can we say, here are the great social changes, here are the great policies that were enacted because there were people in the streets with pickets, occasionally getting out of hand, really making political people feel accountable. I think that's happened in the past in our country. I'm not saying that's always the case, obviously. It just doesn't feel like there's a lot of that now.
Yeah, I think that protests can be really effective in drawing attention to an issue that people don't already know about. So I do think that, let's say, in the civil rights era, with the advent of television combined with certain kinds of protests, seeing the violence with which police acted on peaceful protesters, the attack dogs, the water hoses, seeing kids at lunch counters having people spit in their face and pour milkshakes on their head, were really visceral images that shook parts of the country that didn't really understand the gravity of racial prejudice and segregation. It made it really hit home for them in a certain way. But we've also seen the largest number of people in the streets in American history 2 years ago during the George Floyd protests in 2020. And because those protests weren't connected to any specific, well, there were demands, but those demands were really diffused and co-opted and minimized. And so you never got there was never any real political threat. I don't mean violence, but the political threat of saying, if you don't give me these demands, that I'm not going to withhold my labor, I'm not going to withhold my vote, I'm not going to do anything that would actually cause people in power to want to capitulate. And so here I'm very interested to see what, if anything, these protesters managed to do and say, hey, we're going to actually connect our grievances to something that you need from me. Are some of these women-dominated industries like teachers unions, flight attendants unions, nurses unions going to say we're going to do a labor strike in order to get these rights? Because that historically is what has been successful about protest movements, when they're connected with those kind of economic levers like that.
And that's probably a good point. Connecting them to explicitly more identity type stuff has not, I don't think, worked very well. And I think of the criminal justice reform policing issues as probably a pretty clear example of this at this point. It seems to me over the course of my lifetime, over the course of the last 15 years or so, that an emerging consensus that criminal justice reform was important. There was a lot of Republican interest in it. I mean, even more recently, there has been interest, the First Step Act, things of that nature. But it seems like, or even police violence, the acknowledgement of police violence has gotten more partisan. All of these things have gotten more partisan as the kind of protests, like the George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter protests, have become more about race as the most important issue, which I know race is an important issue when you're talking about criminal justice, but it's almost like, if you're trying to convince an old white person to get on board with criminal justice reform, you wouldn't, like, your selling point wouldn't be, well, this is an issue that really affects black people. You'd be, not because it isn't, but because you're just going to be a little strategic about it. You'd say, this is about a government unaccountable to the citizens. Anybody can be treated like this. This is, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a point that I've made sensitively in the past, which is that if people believe, the same camp that believes we live in a fundamentally racist country believes that, then why, a country that doesn't respect the lives of black people, hashtag Black Lives Matter, then why would you pick an approach that depends on sympathy specifically for black lives instead of broadening the tent and pointing out that so much of the police overreach really does correlate with low-income communities, including a lot of white communities that are terrorized very similarly by police officers out of control. So I think it's a solid point.
Yeah. Well, we wanted to get to this, too. On CNN, the network pondered about the civility of the protests outside the homes of the conservative justices. Let's watch that.
Obviously, what we see, the apparent arson at an anti-abortion nonprofit in Wisconsin is over the line. Violence is always over the line. But there are real questions and conversations today about protests outside Supreme Court justices' houses, particularly Justice Kavanaugh. Where do you think that line is?
I think for a lot of people, a conversation about civility feels like it misses the mark when constitutional rights that you believe that you had for over 50 years are about to be overturned.
Political commentator and podcaster Stephen Miller fired back at the network, saying if anyone posted themselves outside her home, CNN would call it a crisis of the First Amendment and domestic terrorism. And yeah, that's the part of it that, right, I certainly get why someone would argue, well, it's okay this time, or civility has to take a backseat because fundamental rights are being stripped away. But like, people on the other side aren't arguing, like, they disagree that this is a fundamental right, right? And there are like, different people think different things are fundamental rights.
Yeah.
And like, that's the issue. It's not that one side is saying, yes, we should take away fundamental rights. They contest that framing, and liberals would contest some things that conservatives think are Second Amendment. Right.
So I think
right
the better
to be unmasked
line
in the street, some of us would.
Okay. Well, I think the better line to draw for Jarrett there was not the substance of what's being protested, but the quality of whether or not someone is in fact a public figure. So, you know, part of what's at issue is that these Supreme Court justices have an enormous amount of power to affect the lives of millions of people in one way or the other, whether or not you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. And the same is the case if they were, you know, deciding on a Second Amendment case or any other issue. It's the power that they have that I would argue makes them more fair game for these kind of protests. And again, to be clear, these are peaceful protests. So in the abstract, the idea of a young news commentator being protested isn't necessarily a problem if it remains peaceful. I think another part of that power dynamic is that the Supreme Court justices have close protection. They just got additional funding from Congress to protect them further. And if somebody were to decide, oh, I don't like what that journalist has to say, I'm going to come to their house, there is, I think, a sincere higher risk and threat level to them and their safety than exists for these more affluent, more powerful, more congressionally protected individuals.
Fair enough. I do think a lot of progressive or mainstream journalists are playing an interesting game right now in the, we're not public, we're just, lowly little me, I'm just a report, I'm just a documenter, just a chronicler of what's going on. I'm not in the game. So any criticism of me is harassment and dangerous and spreading disinformation or something. But me doing these things to you is holding the powerful accountable. But CNN is powerful. I'm talking about the Washington Post a little bit and some of what they've been doing, and I don't think they quite get that.
No, I think that's fair. And again, I don't think that it's completely beyond the pale, the idea of talking to people in their individual capacity. I mean, we just kind of went through this with the whole libs of TikTok scenario.
That's what I was referring to.
Where people, you know, some people are arguing journalism requires you to go to somebody's house and talk to them. And if everything becomes you're doxxed and it's a threat because you did your job as a journalist and went and knocked on somebody's door and interviewed them, then that certainly isn't good for speech in journalism.
Yeah, fair enough. So you can visit the homes and protest peacefully. Maybe don't, because why? But you can. All right, we'll have more Rising after this.